Okay, good afternoon, everybody, or possibly good morning or something else, depending on where you are. And welcome to today's retro seminar. My name's Alan Morrison. I'm Professor of Law and Finance at the Saïd Business School. I'm joined here today by Rita Mota, who's the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow, also at the Business School, who co-convenes these seminars with me, and by our speaker, Tobey Scharding. Tobey is a philosopher who applies formal ethical theories to managerial decision-making. She's particularly engaged with the ways that managers can evaluate the ethics of new workplace practices and new technologies that lie outside many of our existing accounts of managerial decision-making. She's a research fellow of the Institute for Ethical Leadership at Rutgers Business School. She's very widely published in leading journals, including Business Ethics Quarterly, the Journal of Business Ethics, and Business Society Review. And her book, This is Business Ethics, was published by Wiley Blackwell in 2018. I'm very excited that Tobey was able to join us today. Before I turn the floor over to her, which I shall do in just a moment, I'm going to make a few quick remarks about the seminar, some of which some of you have heard before. RETRO stands for Reputation, Ethics, Trust and Relationships at Oxford. It's a seminar series that's concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organizational life. It's one of a wide range of seminars and conferences that occurs with the generous support of the Centre for Corporate Reputation, which is an interdisciplinary research centre directed here at the Saïd Business School in Oxford by Rupert Younger. Retro has been online since the start of the COVID-19 crisis. Even as people have started to return to the office in greater and greater numbers, Rita and I have decided to retain the online format for the time being because it's worked so well as a way to stimulate fascinating conversations amongst people from all over the world that we otherwise wouldn't easily get to talk to. But making it happen in this way is hard work. So I'd like to thank all of the people who've contributed to the effort. In particular, thank you to Rupert Younger, who's the director of the CCR, and to Hannah Cooper, Chris Page, Mark Hughes Morgan, and Darius Jawa. I'm particularly grateful to Rita, without whom none of this would happen. Her energies, her ideas, and her expertise are completely essential to these seminars. The Corporate Reputation Centre is very concerned with trust, with how it's created, how it's sustained, how it might be lost, and then possibly how it might be rebuilt. Today's talk focuses on these questions in a particular context. Tobey's going to talk about a new conceptualization of trust that she calls technological trust. It's associated with technologies like blockchain. You might ask whether the sort of trust you'd have or do not have in your friends or in your workplace colleagues is the same as the trust you have in your blockchain. And if not, what is technological trust for? What's different about it? And anyway, is trust supposed to be for anything? Tobey's talk's going to help us to think about these questions and will highlight their relevance for business. I think it's going to be fascinating. Tobey's talking about a topic that is very important and also very hot at the moment. So I anticipate quite a lot of discussion. As usual, we're going to be slightly formal about the Q&A process. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A box and not into the chat. And either Rita or I will relay them to Tobey. She's going to speak for between 20 and 30 minutes. And after that, I hope we'll have a reasonably wide-ranging discussion. As usual, we'll finish bang on time at 5 o'clock GMT. So, Tobey, thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the hosts for inviting me. Thank you to all participants who are here. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today. Let me go ahead and get my slides started. Sorry about that. I had flipped through the slides, so we're at the end of the slides, and so we're getting a preview backwards. Welcome. So my name is Tobey Scharding. I'm delighted to be here today speaking with you about the utility of trust. As you know, I will be discussing three different forms of trust: interpersonal trust, institutional trust, and technological trust. On my introductory slide, I have selected two somewhat cryptic images, which are intended to provoke you in rather an open-ended way concerning these topics. And so I think I will leave it at that, hoping that you are suitably provoked and will be engaged and interested in my presentation. So thank you for the introduction. Just a bit about me. I am, of course, a philosopher teaching business ethics at a business school. This gives me a natural interest in deploying the rich resources of the philosophical tradition, particularly focused on philosophical ethics, for use in evaluating applied problems in business. So I take a particular focus on issues concerning finance, technology, and risk. All of these are going to be present today, so I'm very excited about this presentation. And of course, as the title sets forth, I will be using the ethical theory of utilitarianism to hopefully shed some light on issues concerning the new blockchain technology, along with the general role of trust in business. One thing that you may notice, I do have my slides set on automatically advance. This has led people in previous presentations of this topic to say, well, can you really trust the technology that you're using, namely your PowerPoint slides? And I'll say, yes, it will occasionally advance against my wishes, but it does help me to keep up the pace and to get through the slides in a timely manner so we can get to our discussion. So I will be examining one particular research question in this seminar. Ethically speaking, how should conventional financial intermediaries so conventional financial intermediaries is a technical way in the blockchain literature that scholars talk about banks, particularly big banks like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, big banks. How should big banks like these respond to blockchain's challenge to conventional forms of trust? So the assumption here is that banking institutions, financial institutions rely on trust in some crucial way from an ethical perspective, and that blockchain challenges this. So I will be considering two possible responses, the boxes on the right side of the screen. Should intermediaries invest resources in developing the technological forms of trust associated with blockchain, one way of responding, or should intermediaries invest resources in preserving conventional forms of trust, namely the institutional trust in particular, and to a lesser extent, interpersonal trust that have governed these institutions before the blockchain disruption. So to address this question, I will be focusing on three main things. So first, setting forth that challenge, including a brief and decidedly non-technical overview of what blockchain is, a slightly more technical account of these three forms of trust from the management literature in particular that I will be working with, along with a brief discussion of how businesses use blockchain or propose to use blockchain. I will then discuss how ethically big banks should respond to this challenge, including explaining why I've decided to use utilitarianism, as well as setting forth some technical details of utilitarianism that are useful in evaluating this problem, including the good and bad utils and disutils associated with trust itself, as well as a distinctive theory of good and bad in business and finance that I will be employing that is more I'll say a more eccentric or more unusual way of using utilitarianism in this context. And then I will carry out the utilitarian evaluation itself, focused on a thought experiment involving 4 toy societies, so named because they are particularly simple, clear, pleasing to work with. And that these toy societies, I hope, will help us to arbitrate between the 3 forms of trust that I am discussing today. And I will briefly conclude by discussing the extent to which these the results of this thought experiment can be readily applied to business. So what is blockchain? So for our purposes today, the most important thing about blockchain is that it is a technology that allows individuals to make secure financial transactions with one another. In other words, typically to make a secure financial transaction, individuals will rely on a banking institution, for example, to use a credit card to assure that the credit card is charged accurately and is charged only by those parties that the credit card user authorizes to be charged. So blockchain is a way in which people can make those kinds of transactions independent of a banking institution. And this is a brief way in which it does so and why users regard the technology as being secure. So blockchain is aptly named. It is a chain of blocks. Each block contains data, specifically a set of transactions for over a particular time period, along with reference to the block before it, couched in a particular kind of hashing algorithm. And this algorithm and the chain and the decentralized nature allows blockchain to have three characteristics that make its transaction secure. So it is transparent. All blocks can be viewed going back to the original block. That means every single transaction. And the blocks can be viewed by any member of a peer-to-peer community that has the authority to make transactions, to execute and authenticate transactions. The blockchain is immutable. That means that the blockchain cannot be changed except under one specific circumstance, and that is if a majority of the members of the peer-to-peer community agree that there is a problem in a flaw, an error, or that something went wrong in one of the records of the transactions. If such an agreement occurs, then the peer-to-peer community is able to make what's called a hard fork and actually change the blockchain or create a new blockchain with the corrected information. As the peer-to-peer community gets larger and larger, it becomes less and less likely that this consensus will occur. Meaning that the blockchain is, that we can regard the blockchain as being immutable or very close to immutable. And then thirdly, the blockchain is decentralized. So that means there's not a central, there's no executive structure or chain of command regulating the blockchain in the way that there's an executive structure, chain of command at Bank of America or other financial institutions. Rather, the blockchain is run on a widespread network of computers as what's known as a distributed ledger that is accessible at all times to all members of the peer-to-peer community. So the members of this community process the transactions, forming new blocks that are entered on the blockchain. So why is blockchain regarded as being trust-free, or what is the particular challenge that blockchain raises vis-a-vis conventional forms of trust? So this trust-free status comes actually from the original 2008 white paper that introduced Bitcoin in particular to the world, but it actually introduced blockchain as well, although Bitcoin has gotten more attention in some ways. And so the introduction to this white paper explains the attack on trust. We can think about that, or the challenge to trust that Bitcoin and blockchain are going to raise. So to quote, commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions, big banks, serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments. While the system works well enough for most transactions, it still suffers from the inherent weaknesses of the trust-based model. So the author or authors of this white paper are looking to substitute something else that will not be vulnerable to the weaknesses of the trust-based model. So they say what is needed is an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust, allowing any two willing parties to transact directly with each other without the need for trusted third parties. So that's the sense in which blockchain is trust-free, not that the users don't need to trust anything, but just that they don't need to trust a third party. And so from this new conception of trust, or from this criticism of conventional forms of trust, this third-party financial intermediary form of trust has emerged a beautiful literature about the new form of trust, technological trust. I have a slide about the ways in which businesses are using blockchain. I'm going to put off discussing that now. I may discuss it at the end of the presentation if there's time. But it is so businesses are using blockchain. But what's far more interesting, I think, for our purposes, is the the possible ways in which businesses could use blockchain, or the ways in which it may transform financial services. So I'm going to instead get started by discussing briefly these three forms of trust that I am focusing on. And just to mention, you notice that the quotation at the bottom of this slide, I wanted to just give a shout out to the vast literature on trust, which I am largely not using in this presentation. But I do take a general definition of trust from this vast and rich and wonderful literature, namely this quotation from an article by Denise Rousseau and her colleagues from 1998 in the Academy of Management Review, in which they define trust in the following manner. Trust is a psychological state comprising the intention to accept vulnerability based upon positive expectations of the intentions or behavior of another. And I want to highlight that what interests me in particular about this definition, what's useful to me in particular, is the focus on vulnerability. So I will be conceiving of financial transactions as involving this essential kind of vulnerability, but in particular, the vulnerability of occasioning a financial loss. The vulnerability that another party to the transaction will defraud the trusting party, the trustor party. And so I'll be thinking about these three forms of trust as ways of compensating for that vulnerability, or making up for the vulnerability in a way that allows the financial transaction to go through, producing at the end mutual benefit. So three different forms. Interpersonal trust, most basic form of trust. Parties trust the other people with whom they transact. As I mentioned, I will not be referring to the huge and wonderful literature on trust, but rather to a particular subset of articles that have been written basically in the past 10 years or so by scholars who are specifically grappling with technological trust and trying to understand how it relates to other forms of trust. So I've included a couple of these papers here, and the terms that they use to refer to interpersonal trust, so trust in peers, social trust, peer-to-peer trust. And I think that these alternative terms are useful in conceptualizing this basic form of trust. I also have a little visualization to illustrate the relationship of interpersonal trust with that vulnerability and then the financial transaction. So this arrow, the downward pointing arrow, illustrates the order of the financial transaction. The process of the financial transaction from the initial transaction to the successful completion and achievement of mutual benefit at the end. So we have a self-interested transactor A, transacting with self-interested transactor B. These transactors are self-interested in the sense that they are not transacting for the other party's benefit, but for their own benefit. They're seeking to obtain mutual benefit at the end of the financial transaction, and most importantly, they could be tempted to defect from the agreement if opportunities arise. So they are opportunistic potentially. They're not necessarily going to defect, but they could defect. And so in this transaction, what compensates for that vulnerability is the interpersonal trust. I've also substituted, as you can see on this slide, icons to which I think helps to simplify the image to some extent. So transactor A, transactor B, the vulnerability occasioned by their financial transaction is compensated for by their trust in one another. Institutional trust, in turn, parties may be complete strangers. They need not trust each other personally. They need not even know each other. Instead, they trust institutions to mediate their transactions with others. In the literature, this is also called trust in platform, organizational trust, intermediary trust. Visually, we have self-interested transactor A transacting at the bottom with self-interested transactor B via this conventional financial intermediary, and what compensates for the vulnerability of to a financial loss that these parties are experiencing is one of two things in institutional trust. So either, as you see on the right side, institutional trust itself, that would be trust in the conventional financial intermediary itself. So trust in Bank of America, trust in Citigroup. And on the other hand, there's a dispute in the literature about in institutional trust, what is really trusted? Is it Bank of America itself, or is it rather the United States law, in the case of Bank of America, to which the bank is subject? In other words, not that the transactors necessarily trust Bank of America not to defraud them, but rather they trust the United States law to sanction Bank of America if it were to defraud them, and that this threat of sanction for the self-interested transactors is enough to hold the conventional financial intermediary in line and thus compensate the transactors for their vulnerability that they are experiencing in engaging in the financial transaction. And so here's my visualization. Technological trust, finally. So in technological trust, parties trust technologies to perform correctly the functions that they have been programmed to perform, such as executing and authenticating financial transactions. I use this for my visualization. I use the same structure as institutional trust, which seemed interesting to me as I was constructing these visualizations, although I'm not sure if I have anything else to say about that. But you see self-interested transactor A, self-interested transactor B, both experiencing vulnerability in virtue of using blockchain's peer-to-peer network and algorithm. One difference between the technological trust visualization and institutional trust is that what compensates for the vulnerability that these transactors are experiencing is just technological trust. So in relying on blockchain technology, for example, there's no promise that a national legal system is going to protect the users. Rather, the users are standing apart from national legal system. And so that is a big difference of technological trust as compared to institutional trust. In institutional trust, the institution is bound by the laws of a particular country. In technological trust, the users are, not that they're free from those laws, but they are less closely regulated at least at this time than users of conventional financial intermediaries. Okay, so now getting to the heart of the matter, the utility of trust. So now I'm going to do my ethical evaluations and try to understand which of these forms of trust it is most ethical for conventional financial intermediaries to base their business policies upon. So I'll begin by explaining why I've chosen utilitarianism, then explain what form of utility I will be using: pleasure, preferences, individual opportunity, and finally explaining how I will conduct the utilitarian evaluations, and then moving on to the utilitarian evaluations themselves. So I have selected utilitarianism for a couple of reasons. So first of all, the trust literature itself has a utilitarian account of trust. You could see this even in the Denise Rousseau and colleagues' definition of trust, with which I introduced this section of the presentation. The definition of trust focuses on the consequences of trust, the benefits to the parties of trusting one another. So this particular article, so there was just an article just published a couple of weeks ago in the Journal of Business Ethics, accounting or giving an account of how the trust literature has its utilitarian account of trust. Of course, these Dutch scholars are quite critical of the trust literature for this reason. From my perspective, I'm quite pleased to see that the trust literature is seen to have a utilitarian account of trust, because it reinforces my decision to use utilitarianism to evaluate this novel form of trust, technological trust. So what interested me more before encountering this new article led me to choose utilitarianism is the incredible benefits that are associated with trust. In particular, the benefit of cooperation and the production of mutual benefit based on a trusting relationship, either interpersonal trust or institutional trust. I thought that this was an incredibly powerful aspect of trust itself, and investigating trust from an ethical perspective, it led me to want to use a consequentialist ethical theory, namely utilitarianism. Then finally, I'm really asking an essentially comparative question here, so not looking to simply evaluate a form of trust and say, is technological trust ethical? My assumption is that technological trust is ethical, according to other ethical theories like Kantian ethics or virtue ethics. And within that assumption, I'm interested in, so it's ethical, but is it better from an ethical perspective for businesses to be investing in technologies like blockchain, or should they dig in their conventional forms of trust? And so most other of the main ethical theories answer the absolute question: is technological trust ethical? So my examination, so I'm more interested in the comparative question, but I will say that the results here are conditional on further evaluations of technological trust as being ethical by these other ethical theories. So the particular form of utility that I will be examining is not pleasure, associated with classical hedonic utilitarianism, not preferences associated with 20th century utilitarianism, but rather I'm interested in the opportunities that financial transactions extend to individual people as a way of becoming able to pursue and realize their distinctive aims. So this account of finance was set forth by Robert Shiller, the Nobel laureate, in a 2012 book called Finance in the Good Society, in which he explains the ways in which finance helps individual people to pursue and achieve their distinctive aims. So what I'm interested in terms of utility here is the ability of individuals to get into the game and engage in financial transactions. Now, of course, in terms of how am I using utility, I am seeking to use utilitarianism in an elegant and compelling way, in the ways that I have found most inspirational. In particular, actually, in the Foote 1967, Thompson 1985, that refers to the trolley problem, and that idea: is it more ethical to save 5 lives or to save 1 life? This really clear use of utilitarianism really inspired me of the value of considering the numbers of people affected. And so I'll be striving to do that in my utilitarian evaluation. Just a caveat: the good that I will be considering is not the total sum of good, but rather it's whether people are in the game. So it's the good of getting involved in the game of financial transactions. So therefore, each person included in the financial transactions produced by a particular form of trust is going to count as 1 util in favor of that form. So not the actual person's output as a result of their financial transactions, but just the fact that they are in the network for engaging in financial transactions. So the networks created by interpersonal trust, institutional trust, and technological trust, which leads me to my thought experiments. So here I will be briefly considering 4 toy societies. So these societies have only one characteristic: the particular form of trust that they're using. So this is the sense in which they are simplified societies. And I will be thinking about 4 different societies: a no trust society as a comparator, and then the interpersonal trust, institutional trust, and technological trust societies, thinking about the extent of utility produced in each society according to the definition of utility that I have set forth. So society 1, no trust. In this society, people refuse to transact financially with strangers. So here I'm defining a stranger as any person outside their immediate family. This means that financial transactions are limited to the network of the family. So because people refuse to transact with non-family members, their resources are neither made available for financial transactions with others, nor do they gain access to non-family members' resources by way of financial transactions. So the overall utility of this society, I'm saying, is 5, assuming that 5 is an average family size of a family. As you'll see, given my comparative project, it doesn't really matter if you think that the average size of a family is 2 or is 10. The point is that here in the no trust society, the overall utility is pretty small, basically single digit number. Moving on to society 2, interpersonal trust. So in this society, people are willing to transact financially with people outside their immediate family whom they personally trust. So basically, they have to know these people to know that they trust them. In this society, financial transactions occur between non-family members, allowing people to put resources that their family does not need to use. People will only transact financially with others whom they personally trust, limiting the extent of financial transactions. So I'm estimating in the interpersonal trust society, the overall utility is the Dunbar number, 150. So the Dunbar number is, of course, the view of how many people can you know well. And again, it doesn't really matter if you think that the Dunbar number, that the number of people you can know well is more like 50 or is more like 1,000. The point is it's more of a medium number for society 2, interpersonal trust. Moving on to society 3, institutional trust. So in this society, people are willing to transact financially with self-interested strangers. So again, self-interest just refers to the possibility that they could be defrauded. And people are willing to do these transactions via a financial institution that they trust to execute transactions correctly. So they trust the financial institution either because they trust Bank of America itself or because they trust the national law that governs the institution's activities. And they know that that bank will be sanctioned if they defraud them. So in this society, transactions flourish on a national basis, again, because of that national law. So the transactions are limited only by trustworthiness of the national government, along with the fact that people outside of the national borders may lack access to transactions. So the network is one country. And here I'm estimating the overall utility at 1 million as an average number of adult transactors in a country. Again, it doesn't really matter, and you're seeing more with the comparative nature if the country has 100,000 people or 20 million people. The number here is clearly larger than society 2, clearly larger than society 1. And so the question is the number as big as society 4, technological trust? So in this society, people are willing to transact financially with self-interested strangers who could defraud them via trusted blockchain technology. And again, that trust means they trust the technology to execute their transactions correctly, that they will not be defrauded. They will be able to get to the end of that financial transaction and achieve mutual benefit. In this society, trade flourishes globally, limited by people's vulnerabilities to losses, where no trusted government exists to mediate disputes. The overall utility here, I'm estimating as 1 billion people, on the assumption that there are 1 billion people in the world willing to transact in this manner. Of course, as you can see, the actual number doesn't matter. The important thing is that it's bigger, so much bigger than society 3. Leading to my overall evaluation, to maximize utility, conventional financial intermediaries should develop resources related to technological trust. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your comments and criticisms.
Thank you, Tobey.
Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, why don't you stop sharing? We'll go into the Q&A. So can I encourage people to put their questions into the Q&A box? While they do so, I have quite a lot of questions. So let me ask one of them, and then I'll let Rita have a go, and then we'll move on to audience questions. So one question I have about your notion of trust is that it seems like a reasonably thin understanding of trust. So maybe when I trust your initial definition identified trust as placing myself at the risk of being damaged by someone whose intentions or behavior could harm me. And I wonder if it even makes sense to talk about intentions, trust, given that there are intentions in the blockchain and no intentions, at least until they can pass the Turing test, no intentions in any sort of artificial intelligence. It's not clear that this is a meaningful way to compare things. It feels almost like what you're really doing is comparing the size of trading networks. And an economist will tell you that bigger trading networks generate better outcomes, in which case I wonder if you're really saying anything that we didn't understand 50 years ago. And a related question, which genuinely is related, I think, is if your notion of utility is Schiller's, that it's about creating opportunities, I think the notion of the idea of opportunity that you have in mind is one opportunity to establish gains from trade, I guess. So, I have a car, you have some money, I'd like some money, you'd like a car. And if we can find a way to trust each other to make the exchange, we have an opportunity. But perhaps some of the opportunities I would like to develop are opportunities to engage in certain sorts of relationships. So I'd like to develop a close relationship with someone who really understands me, who gets inside my skin, with whom I can partner. And maybe the sorts of technological trust you're talking about actually prevent me from doing that. In a world that's very atomized, where I can do everything through the blockchain, maybe I can't become as much of the sort of person I'd like to be, or that I ought to be, as I otherwise could do. So I also wonder, relatedly, whether the word opportunity here is also being used in a rather thin way. So I'm sorry to open with a challenging question, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts. You must have heard this one before.
Great points, and very, very challenging. And as regards I'll try, but they're so challenging. I don't think I'll completely satisfy you. As regards to the first question, the thin notion of trust, I completely agree, and I think that is it's a characteristic of this particular kind of project that does want to bring in these three forms of trust that are somewhat unlike one another. In other work, I've set forth that blockchain actually is the technological trust in blockchain can't be exclusively just, is the technology going to work? Because the technology, of course, is not independent of human beings. It depends on that peer-to-peer community. In particular, from my point of view, the peer-to-peer community has to be incentivized to continue doing the work of executing and authenticating those transactions. And so typically the community is incentivized by being paid in the cryptocurrency that is associated with a particular blockchain, but the characteristics of the Bitcoin, the trust of the cryptocurrency, and the trustworthiness of the cryptocurrency, I think, are really key things that can interfere, that can cause financial losses to result to the users. So I've chosen a somewhat thin notion of trust so as to bring in the users of to bring in Bitcoin as a possible trustee, an object of trust, but I don't think it's completely thin. In other words, I don't think it's I don't think it's completely technical that the blockchain will the blockchain will uphold its end of the bargain and execute and authenticate those transactions accurately. But I do take that concern about the notion of trust. Regarding the idea about the size of the trading network, so I guess I have received that criticism previously, kind of in the sense that isn't your conclusion kind of obvious? Don't we kind of know this? Isn't this clear that the blockchain network is going to be the biggest because it's the most global? And I think it is, and I think there is something that's obvious about it. I actually think that's a virtue of the evaluation if the other steps are accepted, if it's accepted as an interpretation of utilitarianism, if it's accepted as an ethical evaluation. I think that the end conclusion that it's not just that the businesses should invest in blockchain technologies because it increases the size of the pie, produces more profit, but because it's the more ethical thing to do, I think is a new contribution. And then finally, the idea of what I would consider the downstream effects of technological trust, the way in which technological trust could
atomizes
or could take away some of the benefits associated with the other forms of trust if blockchain or if technological trust becomes overwhelmingly the form of trust that is the basis of society. I think that is a huge problem. I've been trying to develop a view on that, and I'm still working on that. So so thank you for highlighting that. I think that is a big problem for technological trust, and I'm not sure what the answer is.
Great, thank you, Rita.
Well, thanks so much. That was fascinating. And like Alan, I have many questions, but our attendees are already putting a lot of questions of their own in the Q&A box. So I'll just ask one. I was wondering about the conclusions that you derive from your analysis. So you seem to be suggesting actually, the most ethical thing to do is to invest in this type of technology, and so to invest in this form of trust. But I wonder if with such narrow parameters for your analysis, if it's not too risky to suggest such a blunt conclusion, because I mean, in the models that you presented for these different types of societies, it seems very straightforward. I mean, I agree with everything you said within those parameters, but in real life, blockchain, for example, has a tremendous environmental impact. And there are a number of considerations that might come into play when you're thinking about the decision or the morality of a decision to invest more in this type of technology. So what are your thoughts on that?
So that is a great criticism, or a great challenge. I actually have never received that challenge before, and it's really good. I guess, I mean, the way in which I would want to respond to that, I mean, I do. I mean, as I mentioned to Alan, I mean, I think that the conclusion, and with him, is the conclusion a novel conclusion, but also is the conclusion like justified in being so blunt, as you say, depends on the earlier steps, in particular, like using Schiller's idea of the opportunities created by engaging in financial transactions, or the role of engaging in financial transactions in leading to a good life. Is that really a fair conceptualization of utility on the lines of pleasures, or pleasures as have been used for years, or individual preferences which has been used more recently? I mean, my sense is that, my intuition is that it is that the opportunities to realize individual ambitions by gaining access to financing, by gaining access to credit, by gaining the material ability to pursue those ends, whether or not they're successful. That seems to me that it is of like that level of importance, like of the level of satisfying individual preferences, or producing pleasure. But I'm not entirely sure. I would as well say, if I can't prove that individual opportunities to engage in financial transactions are that important, then I would have to draw back the conclusion and make it more modest. If I were able to prove that point, which would be quite a point to prove, I think that at least by my lights, the conclusion would be justified in a blunt form.
Okay, thank you. I think we should move on to the audience questions, Alan. We have a lot.
Okay, we have a lot of questions. I'm going to start with one from Judith Threader, who asks whether she has three sub-questions. I think there are two main points in her question, and it's quite long, so I'm going to précis it a little bit. But her basic question is why we should readily assume that technology enjoys trust. Because most of us have no idea how the blockchain works, and I guess that means, I know slightly, but only fractionally more than you said in your talk, and I think I'm reasonably clued up. So most people have no idea how it works, and they kind of trust it because they're told they should trust it. So there's a question here, as to what extent actually this type of trust is feasible, and is it really separate from other forms of trust? So in order to trust the blockchain, I have to trust the person who tells me that the blockchain works, and I have to understand what they're saying. And the second point she makes is whether it deserves our trust in some sense, because she makes the point that there is a rich literature on the social construction of algorithms and the fact that algorithms and technology can carry forward biases. So in AI, that's well known, screening CVs, that sort of thing. But presumably, blockchain reifies certain sorts of power relationships and certain sorts of, legitimacies. And maybe that's something that, if we trust the blockchain, maybe we're making implicit judgments that we shouldn't make, or that may go against Schiller's notion that these things increase opportunity. I hope I'm not, that means there's going to be a spectrum of trust and it varies by culture. So I think I effectively summarized it. If I haven't, Judith, I'm sorry. But anyway, I think these are interesting questions. What are your thoughts, Tobey?
That's fantastic. So I think that the first question is like really important to me in particular. I've criticized other financial instruments for being impenetrable and therefore like being unethical, just in virtue of being impenetrable. And I think that there is something about blockchain that also is subject to that charge of impenetrability. Particular these hashing algorithms, like how exactly do they make it immutable? Like, can I understand it if I don't have a PhD in computer science? And the answer is no, you really do need technical expertise to understand what makes the algorithm so immutable. But that's not all you need. And so us lay people, we have a strategy too. Namely, we can watch blockchain as it is traversing the world and becoming used by more and more people. Hopefully, at least most of those people do have an understanding of how blockchain really works. And we can see, is blockchain effective? Is it maintaining the security of these people? And so what we've seen so far is that blockchain has not been hacked. And so I think that's really useful evidence for us lay people who don't understand the technical aspects that make blockchain secure. But we see, but it hasn't been hacked. And we know that there are trillions of dollars associated with various blockchains. They're ready sources of money that people would want to hack, but they haven't been able to be hacked. And so I think that no, we don't need the technical expertise to be able to trust blockchain. Rather, we just need common sense to understand what's going on in the ways in which people have encountered difficulties with blockchain, in particular forgetting their IDs. And losing hundreds of millions of dollars. As regards to the second question, that's really interesting. So I'm very, very concerned about issues of bias in algorithms, but I will say I haven't seen at least scholarly writing about bias in the blockchain. Perhaps because the nature of the blockchain is different from a hiring algorithm. It's not conferring a unique benefit for a prestigious position, but it's conferring an ability to engage in a financial transaction. So pretty small kind of benefit. So less at stake. So the ways in which I guess the first thing I want to say in response to this question is it's a great point, and this is something that really should be researched by empiricists to understand how does the blockchain incorporate various biases, in particular like access to computers, access to with Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is a big user of energy, and so people who have access to less expensive energy, people in Iceland, for example, which I didn't know, people in Xinjiang have access to less expensive technology, although there's obviously less expensive electricity. For a problematic reason, but so those people would have increased ability to mine the cryptocurrency, or to be the parties that will add blocks to the blockchain. But it doesn't challenge their ability to use blockchain to make transactions. So also in response to that question, I think it's a great point. I'm not personally aware of biases in blockchain or work having been done on this topic, and I think it should be done.
Rita.
So Marisako is asking three, I think, very interesting questions. The first is about whether the types of trust that you've been discussing are based on individual preferences or on society-wide norms. The second is if you've considered the implications or the consequences of combining more, 2 or 3 types of trusts. And finally, if interpersonal trust could be based on loose reciprocity, like gift exchange, if that type of interpersonal trust would be excluded from a utilitarian approach.
Great. So the first question, something that I have not thought about much, actually. If the conception of trust primarily involves individual preferences or society-wide norms, I suppose. I mean, I think it's more involving individual preferences in the sense that the form of trust is what is enabling people to achieve particular forms of cooperation rather than relying on society-wide norms. But I'm not exactly sure. I think that it may differ based on the form of trust itself, whereas interpersonal trust, I think, would be more dependent on society-wide norms to the extent that the people are conditioned by behavioral norms about what makes a person trustworthy. Like, how do I know that someone is trustworthy or not? Can I do it based on what they say? Can I do it based on what they do, etc.? I think that institutional trust may be more dependent on individual preferences. I'm not exactly sure, though. I know that's not a satisfying answer, so thank you for the question. As regards to the second question, I think that that's a really great suggestion of combining the different forms of trust. I think would be a good way, if I had thought of it, to respond to both Alan and Rita. So combining the forms of trust could make could mitigate problems of relying overmuch on technological trust. If I could have a hybrid society that had interpersonal trust, institutional trust, and technological trust, and it would also blunt the bluntness of the conclusion. It would make maybe make the conclusion a little bit more palatable, that the best society overall is not just a technological society, but rather more of a hybrid society that does offer a place for the important functions played by these conventional forms of trust. And then finally, so thank you for that comment. I think that's very useful, and I think that would improve the analysis to allow for the difference for hybrid societies. And finally, gift giving and interpersonal trust. I think that is interesting. I mean, I think that could be perhaps addressed by a more precise definition of the antecedents of individual trust. So, can individual trust be purchased in a way? I mean, so I mentioned there's a vast literature about trust, and I was not availing myself of this wonderful literature, but there are definitely resources that can be useful there concerning like notions of calculative trust, and is this a form of trust, as opposed to more holistic or organic forms of trust. So it's a very interesting and helpful point. I may not be able to avoid the literature on trust as much as I would like to be honest.
Thanks, Tobey. Alan?
Okay, we have probably time for one more question, although we'll make sure that you get everything that's in the chat. There are a bunch of questions here from Andy Bushman, and including a reference that I wasn't aware of about biases in the blockchain. So I'll make sure.
Oh, great.
He asked one of his other questions is kind of interesting. What if I ask you to do something, and if you don't do it, I'll be harmed, and I tell you that if you don't do it, I will hit you, or throw something at you, or fire a gun at you, or use a weapon, and then you do it because you fear me, and I am exposed because if you didn't do it, it would hurt. Is that trust? Is this a fourth sort of trust based on violence? Because I'm exposed. You have free will. Obviously, it's going to hurt if you don't do it. That's a
so What exactly is being trusted?
He wants to know if there's a fourth form of trust based on the potential use of violence. So I'm trusting you when I expose myself to possible harm because you don't do something. But if you don't do it, I will, hit you with a bat or something. So you're not doing it will meet with violent sanctions because I have a weapon pointed at you. Is that trust or is it just coercion?
So that's interesting. That would be a kind of using the sanctions argument from institutional trust in the interpersonal trust. I take it. The vulnerability is compensated for either because I trust that that the other party won't defraud because I know him to be a reputable person, or because I know that I have a bat and that I will beat him into I will make him fulfill his obligation. Well, I would say no. That's certainly not a form of trust, and I think that I don't know if it gives the lie to the idea that the sanctions form of trust associated with institutional trust could be a form of trust.
That's the point I was kind of think he's getting at. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that a form of trust? I mean, it does. It makes it. I think one of the really interesting thing that it's doing is highlighting the difference in institutional trust between do I have trust for Citigroup itself, or do I just trust the government to come in and coerce Citigroup to fulfill its obligations or its stated obligations to me? I think it relates to a concern about blockchain, namely, is the trust with blockchain and other technologies, is it just this technical kind of trust that the transaction is going to get done, it will be executed, it will be authenticated, or is there something deeper involved? Is there a kind of interpersonal component? And I think that, in response to that concern, I want to say there should be an interpersonal component to trust. Specifically, that like when Wells Fargo is trusted, it's not just the institution, but it's the people behind the institution. It's their, to take a more philosophical view of trust and a thicker view of trust, it's their goodwill that is trusted. I think that kind of thicker form of trust may have to play a role both in institutional trust and the technological form of trust.
Okay, and there's an interesting remark in the chat from someone with an acronym as a name, pointing out that HLA Heart's account of the authority of law might speak to this debate too. But we're bang on 5 o'clock, which means it's time to stop because we were stopped on time. Thank you so much, Tobey, for a really fascinating and excellent conversation. There's an awful lot of stuff in the Q&A that we didn't get to, and we'll make sure you receive a copy of all of it.
Thank you.
I hope that many of the audience will be here for our next retro seminar, which takes place on the 9th of March. Harry van Buren will be talking about a structural injustice approach to business ethics. But for now, we're done. Thank you again, Tobey.